The courthouse in downtown Nashville was buzzing with anticipation that morning. News crews had gathered outside, vans with satellite dishes lined the street, and a swarm of reporters pressed against the steps hoping to catch a glimpse of the trial everyone in the state seemed to be watching. Inside, security was tight. Marshals stood at attention in crisp uniforms, and spectators whispered nervously as they filled the benches. Something about this case felt different. It wasn't just the crime or the people involved. It was the sense that something extraordinary might unfold before their eyes. The courtroom itself was a cavern of solemn wood and echoing silence. Heavy oak benches faced a raised platform where the judge presided. The polished floor reflected the overhead lights, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch across the walls. In the front row, jurors shuffled their notes, pens tapping softly against their pads. They had already sat through weeks of testimony. Forensic experts, police officers, neighbors, and even character witnesses. But today, they were told, someone very unexpected would be brought forward. The defendant sat stiffly at the defense table, flanked by his attorney. He had been careful throughout the trial to maintain an air of composure, but this morning his eyes darted nervously around the room. He seemed to sense that today could mark a turning point. His lawyer leaned close, whispering something meant to reassure, but the defendant didn't relax. Instead, his gaze flicked to the far side of the room, where a uniformed officer stood with a dog. Rex, the police canine, sat obediently at his handler's side. His coat gleamed under the courtroom lights, his eyes sharp yet calm. To the casual observer, he looked like any other well-trained German shepherd, but those who had followed the case knew better. Rex had been the one to track down the missing child, the one whose testimony was expected today. Without Rex, the case might have collapsed. With him, there was hope. Yet no one could have predicted what his presence would stir in the coming hours. The judge entered, his black robe swaying slightly as he took his seat. The room rose then, settled once he gave the signal. Papers shuffled. A cough echoed from the gallery, and then silence fell again. The prosecutor stood, buttoning his jacket, and addressed the court. "Your Honor, the state calls its next witness." All eyes turned as the side door opened. A woman entered, holding the small hand of a child, barely tall enough to see over the witness stand. Gasps rippled through the spectators. A toddler? Many leaned forward, whispering to one another in disbelief. Some jurors exchanged uneasy glances. They had seen children testify before, but rarely one this young. The little girl wore a simple yellow dress, her hair tied back with a pink ribbon. She clutched a stuffed rabbit tightly in her free hand, dragging it along as her mother led her toward the front. Her wide eyes scanned the room, nervous and searching. The weight of the courtroom, with its staring faces and tense air, was overwhelming for someone so small. She pressed herself closer to her mother's side, half hiding behind her skirt. The judge's voice softened. "Good morning, young lady," he said gently. "Do you know why you're here today?" The child didn't answer. She glanced up at her mother, who squeezed her hand and whispered something reassuring. The little girl nodded slightly, though her lips trembled. The prosecutor approached slowly, crouching so his eyes were level with hers. "Hi there," he said with a warm smile. "Do you see that dog over there?" He pointed toward Rex. The child's eyes followed his finger. For the first time since entering, her posture changed. Her face lit up with recognition, her grip on the stuffed rabbit loosening. "Doggy," she whispered, her voice carrying just enough for the microphone to catch. A hush fell over the courtroom. The moment was subtle, but everyone felt it. This wasn't just a child being coaxed into speaking. This was recognition of someone she trusted. She released her mother's hand and took a cautious step forward, eyes fixed on Rex. The defense attorney rose. "Objection, Your Honor," This is highly irregular. A 3-year-old is not a competent witness. The judge raised a hand. Overruled. Let's hear what she has to say. His tone carried more patience than usual. Something in the child's demeanor, something in the dog's calm presence, had struck him too. The prosecutor's voice softened further. Sweetheart, do you know that dog's name? The little girl nodded, though she didn't speak at first. Then, with surprising clarity, she said, Rex. Gasps and murmurs spread through the gallery. Even the jurors, trained to remain neutral, leaned forward with widened eyes. The child had identified the dog without hesitation, confirming she knew him personally. Her mother wiped tears from her cheeks. The prosecutor pressed gently. And do you remember what Rex did for you? The girl hesitated. She clutched her stuffed rabbit tightly again, her small shoulders trembling. For a moment, it seemed as though she might retreat into silence. But then, as if gathering strength, she looked straight at Rex and whispered something only a few in the front could hear. The prosecutor bent closer. I'm sorry, sweetheart. Could you say that a little louder? The girl's tiny voice carried across the microphone this time. He saved. The words echoed through the room, rippling across every heart like a stone dropped into still water. The air grew impossibly heavy. Even the defendant, who had sat smugly moments earlier, shifted uncomfortably in his seat. His attorney whispered furiously, but no one was listening. All attention was locked on the little girl and the dog she had just called her savior. The judge leaned back, momentarily speechless. He had presided over hundreds of cases, some brutal, some heartbreaking, but rarely had he felt the raw truth spoken with such purity. 2 words, uttered by a child too young to fully understand their weight, had just pierced through weeks of legal arguments. Around the room, people dabbed at their eyes. A marshal cleared his throat, trying to hide his emotion. Even the court reporter, usually stone-faced as she typed, blinked rapidly against tears. The silence stretched on, deeper than before, more profound. It wasn't just the silence of a courtroom in session. It was the silence of realization. Something extraordinary had just happened, something no one could have scripted or predicted. A 3-year-old girl, standing gravely before strangers, had delivered a testimony more powerful than any adult's, and she had done it with only 2 words. Rex remained still, his eyes steady, his body poised as though he understood the gravity of the moment. For him, it had simply been instinct, duty, and loyalty. But for everyone watching, it was nothing short of miraculous. And in that suspended silence, before the lawyers regrouped, before the judge spoke again, the courtroom knew one thing. This trial had just changed forever. The murmurs still hadn't faded when the little girl was helped onto the oversized witness chair. She looked impossibly small against the towering wood, her feet swinging in the air, not even close to touching the floor. A microphone had been adjusted downward, but it still seemed too large, too imposing for her tiny voice. The judge leaned forward, peering at her over his glasses. His stern face, usually unreadable, softened almost imperceptibly. Take your time, he said gently. No one is rushing you. The child clutched her stuffed rabbit tighter, its matted fur evidence of how many times it had been squeezed for comfort. Her mother had been asked to step back to the gallery, but her eyes never left her daughter. Every muscle in her body ached to run forward, scoop her up, and protect her from the heaviness of the courtroom. But she knew this was something her little girl had to do herself. The prosecutor approached slowly, careful not to tower over the child. He crouched a few feet away, making himself small, his voice soft. Hi, sweetheart, he said warmly. Do you remember me? The girl hesitated, then gave a tiny nod. She had seen him before, in a quieter room, one without so many staring faces. She remembered his kind smile, and the way he'd offered her a cup of apple juice. "That's right," the prosecutor continued. "We talked before, didn't we? And you told me about someone very special." The child's eyes flickered nervously around the courtroom. Too many strangers. Too many eyes. She hugged her rabbit tighter. Then her gaze landed on Rex. The dog hadn't moved from his handler's side, but the moment her eyes found his, she relaxed just slightly. Her lips parted. "Doggy," she whispered again. The prosecutor smiled. "Yes, that's Rex. Do you remember Rex?" This time her nod was stronger. "Rex," she said clearly, surprising even herself with the boldness of her voice. The jurors exchanged glances. Some had children or grandchildren near her age. They knew how unpredictable toddlers could be. A wrong word, a burst of tears, and the testimony might crumble. But there was no mistaking the look in the little girl's eyes. She knew this dog. She trusted him, and trust, in that moment, meant everything. The defense attorney rose, already bristling. "Your Honor," he objected, "this is prejudicial. A child this age cannot possibly provide credible testimony. The jury is being manipulated by sentiment." The judge didn't answer immediately. Instead, he studied the girl, who was still gazing at Rex with a mixture of awe and comfort. Finally, he spoke, objection overruled. "The court will hear what she has to say. The jury will decide the weight it carries." The defense attorney sat down, grumbling, but the damage was already done. The jury wasn't just watching a child, they were witnessing a bond. The prosecutor leaned closer, still crouched. "Sweetheart, can you tell us what happened when you saw Rex?" The girl blinked, her lashes wet with unshed tears. She looked at the dog again. "He came," she whispered. The prosecutor tilted his head. "He came?" She nodded more firmly this time. "I was scared, but he came." Her words, though simple, sent another ripple through the courtroom. The jurors scribbled furiously in their notebooks. The child's mother covered her mouth to stifle a sob. The prosecutor gently asked, "What did Rex do when he came?" The little girl hesitated. Her memory, though fragmented, carried the weight of survival. She remembered the dark place, the cold floor, the sound of footsteps she didn't trust. And then Rex, his bark, his warmth when she touched his fur. The moment she stopped feeling completely alone, her small voice carried again, "He found me." The defense attorney shot to his feet. "Objection." Leading the witness. A judge shook his head firmly. "Overruled." She is telling us in her own words. The defense sat down heavily. He knew the damage was already building like a storm he couldn't stop. The prosecutor didn't push further. He knew better than to overload her. Instead, he paused, giving her space. The silence stretched, but it wasn't awkward. It was expectant. The jurors leaned in, not wanting to miss a word. The little girl rubbed her rabbit's ear nervously, her voice softer now. "I was lost. Then Rex found me." Her declaration, so simple and yet so profound, hung in the air. It wasn't polished testimony. It wasn't rehearsed. It was the truth as only a child could say it. The courtroom gallery stirred, emotions spilling over. Some people openly wiped tears. Others clasped their hands tightly, as if holding themselves. Together, even the marshal at the back shifted uncomfortably, his throat tightening. Rex, still calm and obedient, flicked an ear at the sound of her voice, but didn't move. His handler gave a subtle nod of approval. The dog had been trained to remain still, but even without moving, his presence anchored the little girl like nothing else could. The prosecutor, sensing the weight of her words, decided to step back. "Thank you, sweetheart," he said kindly. "You're very brave." The judge cleared his throat. "Would you like some water?" he asked the child. She shook her head, still clutching her rabbit. Her gaze hadn't left Rex, And in that moment, everyone in the courtroom saw what words could barely capture: the unspoken bond between a child and the dog who had saved her. It wasn't about eloquence. It wasn't about legal strategy. It was about truth, raw and unfiltered, delivered by the most unlikely witness. The defense attorney buried his face in his notes, already preparing to argue later that the child's testimony was unreliable. But even he knew deep down that the image before the jury was unforgettable. As the prosecutor returned to his seat, the judge allowed a brief recess. The jurors filed out slowly, their faces pale, their eyes damp. They had witnessed something that no amount of legal jargon could undo. The child was lifted gently from the stand by a court officer and reunited with her mother. She immediately wrapped her arms around her, burying her face in the safety of her embrace. Yet even as she clung to her mother, she peeked over her shoulder at Rex one last time. The dog hadn't moved, but his eyes followed her as she was carried away. And in those steady brown eyes lay the silent confirmation of everything she had said. The courtroom settled into uneasy silence. The weight of her presence still lingered, heavier than any evidence box or forensic chart. The jurors, though dismissed for a short break, carried her words with them into the hallway. He came. He found me. It was enough to fracture the defenses. Carefully built case. Enough to shift the jury's hearts. Enough to remind everyone in that solemn chamber that sometimes justice doesn't arrive in legal arguments or polished testimony. Sometimes it arrives in the trembling voice of a child and in the steady presence of a dog who never wavered. And though the trial was far from over, everyone knew this. The little girl's testimony had changed everything. The jurors returned slowly from the recess, still shaken by what they had just witnessed. They filed into their seats with the heaviness of people who had glimpsed something raw and unforgettable. The judge banged his gavel once, signaling the trial was back in session. Yet even as the formality of procedure resumed, the memory of the child's trembling voice, he came. He found me, clung to the air like smoke after a fire. At the witness stand, the little girl sat once again, her stuffed rabbit tucked into her lap. A glass of water had been placed near her, though she hadn't touched it. Her mother sat farther back in the gallery, whispering prayers into her clenched hands. Rex still rested near his handler, his eyes unblinking, his body tense but calm. The connection between the child and the dog was as visible as the sunlight streaming through the courtroom's high windows. The prosecutor knew he had to tread carefully. Pushing too hard might overwhelm the child, but too little might rob the moment of its strength. He rose slowly, buttoning his suit jacket, and walked toward her with the same gentle steps one would take toward a skittish bird. "Sweetheart," he began softly, crouching again so that his eyes met hers. "Can you tell us if you know this?" "Dog?" For a long moment, silence stretched. The child stared at her lap, twisting the ear of her stuffed rabbit between her small fingers. Her lips moved soundlessly, rehearsing words she wasn't sure she could release. The prosecutor waited. Patiently, his posture calm, his tone kind. Finally, she lifted her head. Her gaze skipped past the prosecutor, past the judge, and locked onto Rex. Her tiny body seemed to relax instantly, as though she had been holding her breath all along. "Yes," she whispered. The word was barely audible, but it was enough. Gasps fluttered through the courtroom like wind rustling leaves. The stenographer froze, then quickly caught herself, fingers flying across the keys to record the moment. The judge leaned forward, his brow furrowing as if committing her word to memory. The prosecutor nodded gently. "You do know him?" She nodded again, stronger this time. "Rex," she said clearly, her voice trembling but determined. This time, the gallery could not contain themselves. Whispers spread like wildfire. A marshal had to hush the crowd. The jurors leaned forward, wide-eyed, as though watching history unfold before them. A toddler had just identified the very dog who had rescued her, and she had done so without hesitation. A defense attorney sprang to his feet. "Objection, Your Honor," he barked, his voice sharp and desperate. "This is leading. She's too young to be reliable. This entire line of questioning is prejudicial." The judge lifted a hand, silencing the outburst. His eyes softened again as he looked at the girl. "Overruled. The witness may continue." "Proceed carefully, counselor." The defense attorney slumped back into his chair, frustration etched across his face. He knew the longer the jury saw this child's bond with Rex, the weaker his arguments became. Logic and technicalities could not stand up against innocence and truth. The prosecutor, still crouched, gave the child a small smile. "You're doing so well. Can you tell us what Rex did for you?" The question hung in the air like a fragile thread. Everyone leaned in, waiting. The child's lips trembled again. Her eyes darted to her mother, then back to Rex. She swallowed hard, her tiny hands clutching her rabbit so tightly it seemed strained. And then, in a voice so pure it sliced through the tension like glass, she answered, "He saved." The words struck the room like thunder. They weren't loud, but their impact was immeasurable. Jurors' mouths fell open. A woman in the gallery stifled a sob. Even the judge's hand trembled slightly as he adjusted his glasses. "He saved," the child repeated, this time louder, as if the act of saying it once had given her strength to say it again. She pointed at Rex with her small hand, her fingers steady. "Rex saved me." The room erupted in gasps and quiet cries. One juror dabbed her eyes with a tissue. Another leaned back, shaking his head as though unable to process the magnitude of what he had just heard. The prosecutor closed his eyes briefly, silently thanking the heavens for the clarity in those two simple words. The defense attorney shot up again, his voice cracking with urgency. "Objection, Your Honor, this is emotional manipulation. This child cannot possibly understand the gravity of what she's saying." The judge turned slowly, fixing him with a gaze so sharp the attorney froze mid-sentence. "Sit down, counselor," the judge said firmly. "The jury will weigh the testimony for themselves. The child's words stand." The defense sank back into his chair, defeated, sweat glistening at his temple. He scribbled furiously in his notes, but it was clear his confidence had shattered. The prosecutor didn't press further. He knew he had been given a gift more powerful than any cross-examination, any forensic exhibit, any expert testimony. 2 words had done what hours of evidence could not. Still crouched, he spoke softly. "Thank you, sweetheart. You're very brave to tell us that. Can I ask you one more question?" The girl nodded timidly, still staring at Rex. "When Rex found you, were you afraid?" The courtroom seemed to stop breathing. The little girl blinked, then shook her head slowly. "Not when he was there," she whispered. Tears streamed freely down her mother's face. Jurors clutched tissues. Even the hardened bailiff shifted, his jaw tightening as he looked away. The prosecutor smiled softly, sensing the moment had reached its natural end. "That's all I have, Your Honor." The judge nodded, his voice heavy with emotion. "The witness may step down." As the child was lifted from the stand, her eyes never left Rex. She reached a tiny hand toward him as she passed, and though his handler kept him steady, Rex's ears pricked forward, his gaze locked onto her until she disappeared into her mother's arms. The silence that followed was unlike any other in the courtroom's history. It wasn't procedural. It wasn't expectant. It was reverent, as if everyone present understood they had just witnessed a truth deeper than law. And as the jurors sat in stunned stillness, one thought echoed in every mind. 2 words from a child had just shifted the entire trial. The courtroom seemed to hold its breath. Even after the little girl had spoken, the weight of her words, "he saved," still lingered in the air, echoing off the polished wood and high ceilings. The prosecutor and judge shared a glance, knowing they were witnessing something far beyond ordinary testimony. Jurors sat frozen, pens poised mid-air, struggling to record the moment while processing the raw power of innocence speaking truth. The defense attorney, meanwhile, was visibly frustrated. He rose, shuffled papers, and attempted to redirect the courtroom's attention. "Objection, Your Honor." "This is the judge," silenced him with a slow, deliberate hand raise. His voice, calm yet firm, cut through the tension. "Sit down. The child's testimony is admissible. The jury may determine its weight." Even the usually stoic court reporter paused, fingers hovering above the keyboard. The room seemed suspended, in a moment of awe, as though time itself had slowed. The little girl clutched her stuffed rabbit to her chest, her eyes fixed on Rex. The dog sat patiently, his tail still, ears alert. Though silent, he radiated presence, a silent guardian embodying courage, loyalty, and the protection he had offered when it mattered most. The prosecutor leaned in, lowering his voice so that it was both gentle and steady. "Sweetheart, can you tell us what Rex did when he found you?" The child blinked, uncertainty flickering across her face. She inhaled deeply, steadying herself, her lips parted, and a small voice cut through the silence. "He saved." For a heartbeat, nothing else existed. 2 words, that was all. Yet in their simplicity was a truth so profound that it transcended the courtroom, reaching every heart present. Gasps whispered through the gallery, stifled cries escaped from the spectators, and some jurors instinctively pressed tissues to their faces. The air, thick with tension just moments before, now vibrated with a strange, awestruck energy. The defense attorney pinched the bridge of his nose, muttering under his breath, "This is preposterous. It's emotional manipulation." He rapped his knuckles on the desk. "This has nothing to do with the law." The judge, however, was unmoved. He leaned forward slightly, eyes softening as he watched the little girl. "Silence," he said firmly. "The jury will consider the testimony as it stands." "Proceed, counselor." The jurors, some of whom were parents themselves, could barely maintain composure. A mother sitting in the gallery quietly dabbed at her cheeks, while a father leaned forward, gripping the bench as if to steady himself. Even the stenographer, whose job was to remain detached, blinked rapidly, tears threatening to spill as she typed the girl's words verbatim. The prosecutor, sensing the significance of the moment, didn't rush. He allowed the silence to stretch, letting every person in the room absorb the weight of the child's testimony. Then he asked again, his voice a gentle guide rather than a pressure. "Can you tell us what you felt when Rex found you?" The little girl's eyes filled with tears. She hesitated, then whispered, "I was scared, but he made it better." Every heart in the room sank a little. Her words, innocent and fragmented as they were, carried more truth than volumes of evidence. This wasn't performance. This wasn't coaching. This was memory, recall, and gratitude distilled into its purest form. Rex, still alert and poised, tilted his head slightly. His amber eyes followed her every word. To anyone unfamiliar with canine training, it might have seemed like coincidence. But those who knew him understood that his every gesture, every shift in posture, was communication. He was acknowledging her, connecting with her, reinforcing the truth she was trying to convey. The judge cleared his throat, unable to hide his own emotion. "Let this stand as a reminder," he said softly, "that the simplest truths are often the most profound." The courtroom remained silent, not out of obligation, but out of reverence. The little girl, emboldened by the acknowledgement, and the calm presence of Rex, leaned slightly forward, and added another word. He saved. Me? The gallery erupted into quiet murmurs, some sniffles audible, some whispered exclamations of awe. 2 words had become 3, each one carrying monumental weight. Even the most hardened attorneys and law enforcement officers felt the gravity settle over them. This was no ordinary testimony. The defense attorney shook his head, scribbling furiously in his notes, his arguments failing before the innocence of a child. "This is ridiculous," he muttered. "How can anyone take this seriously?" But seriousness didn't matter anymore. The truth had been delivered, raw and undeniable, in the most authentic form possible. Every juror understood that what they had heard was more than words. It was a living testament. A life saved, a bond formed, a moment of courage encapsulated in the voice of a 3-year-old girl. The prosecutor allowed her a brief pause. He didn't push. He knew that the more he guided her, the more he risked tainting the purity of her testimony. Instead, he offered soft reassurance. "You're doing wonderfully. Can you tell us how Rex made you feel safe?" Her voice, tiny and trembling, filled the room. "He kept me close. He didn't leave me. I wasn't alone." Even the judge's stoic features softened. He adjusted his robe, his hands trembling slightly as he scribbled notes. Every adult in that courtroom felt the echo of fear and relief conveyed in her simple words. The prosecutor didn't ask further questions. There was no need. She had said enough. The little girl's story, brief as it was, resonated far beyond the trial. It reminded everyone present of the human or canine capacity for courage, protection, and compassion. In a world dominated by logic, evidence, and procedure, 2 small words had shattered expectations. He saved. Rex, ever faithful, remained seated by his handler, ears slightly forward, eyes focused, as though confirming every word she had spoken. For him, it was instinct, training, and memory. For the courtroom, it was a miracle. The judge allowed a brief recess. Whispered conversations spread like wildfire. The gallery couldn't stop discussing the child's bravery and the dog's loyalty. News cameras had captured portions of the testimony, and journalists outside were already reporting on a story that would become national news. A 3-year-old girl and a police dog whose bond could move hearts more than any legal argument. Her mother, trembling but proud, knelt beside her daughter as they stepped away from the stand. The child clutched her rabbit tighter now, but her eyes still sparkled with the trust and love she had for Rex. In that moment, she was more than a witness, she was a symbol of hope. Even as the trial continued, everyone in that courtroom understood one unshakable truth. Sometimes courage comes in the smallest packages. Sometimes the voice of a child and the presence of a loyal dog can speak louder than all the evidence in the world. And on that day, in that courtroom, the words he saved echoed endlessly, not only across the walls of justice, but into the hearts of everyone who bore witness. The courtroom still vibrated with the weight of the little girl's words. He saved. Simple, yet profound. Jurors sat in stunned silence, trying to reconcile the power of those 2 words with the sterile logic of law they were sworn to weigh. Even the reporters, scribbling furiously in their notebooks, paused occasionally to glance up, as if unsure that such a moment could truly belong in a courtroom. The prosecutor, sensing that the moment had reached its peak, but that more truth could still unfold, approached carefully. "Sweetheart, can you tell us more about what happened when Rex found you?" The girl hugged her stuffed rabbit tighter, blinking rapidly. Her small voice trembled, not from fear, but from the enormity of the memory she was about to share. She had witnessed fear, darkness, and confusion at an age too young to fully comprehend them. But now she had a safe space and the presence of Rex, the dog she trusted, to guide her words. I was alone," she began softly. her tiny hands gripped the microphone, making it tilt slightly. I was scared. The floor was cold. I didn't know where to go. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. The gallery shifted uneasily in their seats. Some covered their mouths with their hands. Others leaned forward, riveted, as though the child's story was a living thread weaving through the courtroom, pulling at hearts and memories alike. The prosecutor nodded gently, encouraging her to continue. And then Rex came? The girl's eyes filled with tears. Yes, he came. And he barked at the people. They couldn't get close. But he stayed with me. The room went silent again. No one moved, afraid of breaking the fragile honesty that hung in the air. Every person present seemed to feel the weight of the girl's fear and the dog's protective courage. The jurors exchanged glances, some nodding slightly, as though acknowledging that sometimes truth is communicated not through words alone, but through instinct, courage, and the bond between beings. The defense attorney scribbled notes, attempting to regain control, but his frustration was evident. Objection! Leading the witness, he shouted, voice trembling slightly. The judge, who had already experienced the extraordinary nature of this testimony, shook his head, overruled. The witness is speaking from her own recollection. The child continued, her small voice gaining confidence. He stayed. By my side, I wasn't alone anymore. I didn't feel scared when he was there. Her mother dabbed at her eyes from the gallery. Tears streamed freely, and she clasped her hands tightly, her chest heaving. Even seasoned officers in the courtroom, hardened by years of danger and duty, shifted uncomfortably, their normally stoic faces betraying emotion. The prosecutor gave her a gentle nod. That's very brave. Can you tell us what you did when Rex stayed with you? The girl hesitated, her tiny fingers fidgeting with the edge of her dress. She glanced at her mother, then back at Rex. I hugged him. I held him. I knew he wouldn't leave. A hushed murmur ran through the courtroom. The jurors scribbled rapidly, trying to capture the power of her words. 2 weeks of testimony, expert opinions, and legal documents could not have conveyed the depth of courage and relief that her few simple sentences did. She wasn't simply recounting facts, she was reliving a life-altering moment. Rex shifted. Slightly, but remained obedient. He didn't need to bark or perform tricks. His very presence communicated what the child could not fully articulate: protection, loyalty, and the assurance that she was safe. For the spectators, the dog's calm, steady posture reinforced every word the girl had said. The judge's hands rested on the bench as he observed the scene. He rarely allowed emotion to interfere with procedure, yet the authenticity of the child's account and the visible bond with Rex made it impossible to remain detached. He cleared his throat and addressed the courtroom, his voice gentle but authoritative. Let it be noted that the witness is giving her testimony freely and from memory. The court acknowledges the courage it takes for someone so young to recount events of such magnitude. The defense attorney slumped back into his chair, muttering under his breath. His carefully constructed arguments were crumbling. His focus had been on logic, on evidence, on cross-examination, but none of that could outweigh the stark honesty of a 3-year-old recounting fear and salvation. The little girl leaned slightly closer to the microphone. I was crying, she whispered. I didn't know what to do. But Rex, he stayed. He made me feel safe. I love him. A ripple of emotion passed through the gallery. Some audience members dabbed at tears. Even the jurors, sworn to neutrality, could not hide the way their eyes glistened. The child's declaration was simple, yet profound. The innocence of her. Age made the words even more compelling. This wasn't performance. It was memory, gratitude, and truth wrapped into one fragile human package. The prosecutor smiled softly, careful not to rush her. "Can you tell us if Rex helped anyone else?" The little girl shook her head, her voice earnest. "No, just me." The simplicity of her answer carried more weight than volumes of reports. She wasn't exaggerating. She wasn't trying to impress the courtroom. She was telling the truth, as she remembered it, and that truth was undeniable. The judge scribbled a few notes, then looked up, surveying the courtroom. "Let this testimony stand as a testament to courage, trust, and the extraordinary bond between a child and an animal, trained to protect." Rex, sensing the gravity, moved slightly closer to the stand. The handler allowed him the freedom, and the dog's gaze softened as it met the child's. She reached a tentative hand toward him, and for a moment their connection was palpable, silent, yet more eloquent than any spoken words. The prosecutor allowed the child a brief pause before concluding. "Thank you, sweetheart. You've done very well. Can you step down now?" She nodded, a small smile tugging at her lips despite the might. Tears still streaking her face. Her mother embraced her immediately, holding her tightly, whispering soothing words. Yet even in that embrace, her eyes darted back to Rex. The bond had been cemented forever in that brief, intense moment. The gallery remained quiet for a beat longer, as though none could bear to disturb the fragile magic of the testimony. The jurors filed out slowly for a short recess, still murmuring among themselves, their expressions a mixture of awe, empathy, and respect. Even the defense attorney seemed subdued. He muttered into his notes, clearly frustrated, but he could not undo what the child had just revealed. 2 weeks of strategic argument and procedural precision paled against the clarity of truth spoken in innocence. As the little girl was guided out of the courtroom, she glanced once more at Rex. He remained seated, head high, alert yet calm. In his eyes, she saw the silent promise of protection, the validation of her words, and the reassurance that she had survived. That day, the trial shifted in ways no one could have anticipated. The child's words carried more weight than evidence. Charts, forensic reports, or expert testimony. They reminded everyone present that truth can emerge in the most unexpected forms, sometimes in a small, trembling voice, sometimes in the steady gaze of a loyal companion. And though the trial would continue, the memory of her testimony lingered. In every heart, the fear, the rescue, the comfort, and above all, the undeniable courage of a child whose innocence had spoken louder than any adult's argument could ever hope to. The courtroom remained still after the little girl's testimony, the air thick with reverence and disbelief. Every spectator felt the weight of her words. "He saved me." The jurors shifted in their seats, their pens suspended mid-air, processing. A truth that could not be measured by charts, evidence, or argument. For the first time that day, the courtroom was silent, not from decorum, but from the raw, human impact of what had unfolded. Rex, the K9, had remained stoic throughout the child's account, trained to respond to commands, to restrain instinct. He had sat patiently, allowing the courtroom to absorb the gravity of the moment. Yet there was an unmistakable tension in his body, a readiness as if he knew the story wasn't yet complete. His amber eyes followed every movement, ears pricked. Forward. Something was about to happen, something the courtroom had not anticipated. The judge adjusted his glasses and cleared his throat. "This court will now take a brief pause," he announced, but his voice betrayed his own wonder. He had witnessed countless testimonies in his career, but rarely had one carried such palpable emotion, such undeniable authenticity. Even the defense attorney's rigid composure had begun to crack under the weight of truth delivered by a 3-year-old. The little girl remained seated at her mother's side, gripping her stuffed rabbit tightly. Yet her gaze had not left Rex. She was not finished with him, not finished with the story, not finished with the bond that had saved her life. Slowly, she extended her tiny hand toward the dog. The spectators gasped softly, whispering among themselves. Could the handlers allow such contact in a courtroom? Rex's handler, reading the girl's intent, relaxed slightly. The dog shifted forward ever so cautiously and lowered his head toward her. His eyes met hers, steady, calm, almost understanding. The connection was immediate and profound. For the little girl, this was not just a dog. This was her protector, her savior, the being who had stood between her and fear when no one else could. The prosecutor leaned down, speaking softly to the child. "Go ahead, sweetheart. You can reach out." With a trembling hand, the little girl reached toward Rex. The courtroom held its collective breath. Each juror, spectator, and officer knew that this was more than a gesture. It was the culmination of terror, courage, and trust, compressed into one fragile human moment. She touched his fur, and Rex responded with gentle stillness, resting his head lightly on her lap. The gallery reacted immediately. Tears streamed freely down the faces of many. Even seasoned journalists, trained to remain neutral and detached, dabbing at their eyes as they typed furiously, couldn't contain their emotions. The bond was visible to all. It was undeniable. The truth of what had occurred was no longer confined to words. It had taken a living form. The judge, his voice thick with emotion, allowed the moment to linger. Let the record reflect the bond between witness and canine, a bond forged in courage and trust. No further explanation is necessary. The defense attorney's hands tightened around his notes. His arguments had been built on procedure, evidence, and logic, but none of it mattered now. He was powerless before this raw, living proof. The child's words, the dog's presence, and the visible connection between them had swayed hearts in ways no legal tactic could. The little girl whispered, almost inaudibly, "My hero." Her mother covered her mouth with her hands to stifle sobs, while the child's eyes glistened with unshed tears. Rex remained perfectly still, yet every slight movement, his gentle blink, the shift of his weight conveyed acknowledgement. He understood the gratitude, the relief, the bond. The jurors' faces betrayed awe, empathy, and wonder. Some had never seen courage in its purest form. Others were parents themselves, overwhelmed by the realization that the most vulnerable among us could exhibit such bravery. The courtroom, hardened by countless trials, had softened. The prosecutor's voice broke the silence. "Your Honor, we will not need further questions. The witness has spoken the truth as she remembers it. The evidence is clear. Rex was instrumental in her rescue, and the child's account is consistent and heartfelt." Even the judge's usual formality could not contain his admiration. This courtroom has witnessed a rare demonstration of courage, loyalty, and the bond between human and animal. Such testimony transcends conventional measures and touches. The very essence of truth. The defense attorney tried one last attempt to reclaim control. "Your Honor, I object." "This is irrelevant." The judge shook his head. Objection overruled. The jury will decide the relevance, but the truth of the witness's experience is undeniable. Outside the courtroom, news crews were already capturing live footage, but inside, the moment was far more intimate. Every heart present understood that justice was no longer just legal. It was emotional, profound, human. The little girl had conveyed a truth that no adult lawyer could articulate. That courage, love, and loyalty are measured not in words alone, but in presence and action. The little girl hugged her rabbit tightly, but her hand never left Rex. For a moment, the courtroom existed solely in that shared space of understanding. The gallery, jurors, attorneys, officers, and spectators, all were silent, allowing the gravity of the moment to resonate. The prosecutor smiled softly, giving the child space while signaling to the jury to take note of the authenticity. "Thank you for being so brave," he said. Rex shifted slightly, a subtle wag of his tail, a silent affirmation. It was as if the dog, through instinct and memory, was recognizing the child's words, reinforcing them without needing to speak. The judge allowed a recess, signaling the child and her mother to step aside. Even as she left the witness stand, her gaze never left Rex. She waved a small hand, and Rex's eyes followed hers, unblinking, loyal, steady. The courtroom slowly exhaled, collectively recovering from the intensity of the moment. Jurors whispered. Lawyers exchanged glances, and spectators dabbed at their eyes. Everyone present knew they had witnessed something extraordinary, a bond between a human child and a canine hero, manifested in courage, gratitude, and truth. That day, the trial shifted irrevocably. The legal arguments, charts, and evidence remained, but they were now accompanied by the undeniable human element, the child's life, saved, and the living proof of that salvation standing before them. Even after the trial resumed, the echoes of her words and the dog's presence lingered in the air. Every witness called afterward seemed to carry less weight compared to the living testimony of courage that had unfolded. The jury would never forget it. The gallery would tell the story for years. Can the child? She had experienced a moment that would define her life forever. The courtroom remained heavy with the aftermath of the child's testimony and Rex's silent response. Every eye was fixed, every breath seemed suspended, as if the walls themselves were holding back the echoes of those two simple words. Saved? The jurors, spectators, and officers alike were caught in a web of awe and empathy, struggling to reconcile what they had just witnessed with the cold precision of law. The judge, normally stoic and unflinching, stared down at the child. And the dog. His hand rested on the bench, knuckles white, as he absorbed the gravity of the moment. Throughout his career, he had presided over countless trials, ranging from petty theft to high-profile cases. Yet never had he encountered testimony so pure, so human, and so impossible to contest. He leaned back slightly, fingers steepled under his chin, eyes misting with emotion he could neither hide nor fully express. The defense attorney shifted uncomfortably, aware that the room had moved far beyond strategy, procedure, or technicalities. Logic alone could not compete with a story of fear, courage, and salvation delivered by a 3-year-old child and embodied by a canine. Let the record reflect, the judge said finally, his voice soft but commanding attention, that this court has witnessed extraordinary testimony today. The bravery of the witness and the actions of the canine are beyond the ordinary scope of procedure. This court acknowledges the emotional and moral weight of what has been presented. A murmur ran through the courtroom gallery, hushed but palpable. Jurors exchanged glances, their pens momentarily idle. They were aware that what they had seen could not be quantified by legal metrics alone. They had glimpsed the raw truth of fear and protection, courage and loyalty. And they understood, instinctively, that these moments would resonate far beyond the courtroom. The child remained seated with her stuffed rabbit, her tiny hands gripping it tightly. Her eyes, however, remained fixed on Rex. She had seen him. In the quiet moments before the trial began, had felt his presence during her recounting, and now she knew he was still with her. Not just as a dog trained to obey commands, but as a protector, a companion, a living reminder that she had survived. The prosecutor rose, his voice steady and warm. Your Honor, I submit that the witness's testimony, combined with the observable, bond with the K9, provides an irrefutable account of the events in question. Her recollection is clear, coherent, and consistent. More importantly, it carries an authenticity that no expert report or document can replicate. The defense attorney shot up, flustered. Objection. This is emotional manipulation. The jury is being swayed by sentiment rather than fact. The judge's gaze hardened, but only slightly. The objection is noted and overruled. The jury is fully capable of evaluating the testimony's credibility. The court recognizes the emotional resonance, but leaves the weight to the jurors. Judgment. Despite the procedural ruling, it was clear to everyone that the courtroom had shifted irreversibly. The defense attorney scribbled furiously in his notes, but his attempts to dominate the narrative seemed trivial compared to the power of innocence speaking truth. The child whispered again, almost to herself, "Rex stayed with me." "He didn't." "Leave." Her voice carried a quiet certainty, a truth that could not be argued or refuted. The jurors leaned forward instinctively, listening not just to words, but to the courage embedded in them. The gallery watched in silence, absorbing the unspoken gravity. Mothers and fathers understood the depth of fear the child had experienced. Officers nodded subtly, recognizing the training, loyalty, and bravery of Rex. Even journalists, accustomed to recording facts, paused in awe, understanding they were witnessing a story far greater than the ordinary news cycle. The judge, taking a deep breath, allowed a pause. He looked at the child and Rex, and then out across the courtroom. "Sometimes," he said slowly, "the simplest words convey truths more profound than volumes of evidence. What has been shared today is not merely testimony. It is a testament to courage, protection, and trust." Rex shifted slightly, as if acknowledging the judge's words. His steady gaze never wavered from the child. The subtle movement, a gentle tilt of the head, a barely perceptible wag of the tail, communicated a silent affirmation. The bond was evident to everyone in the room, a living narrative that required no translation. The prosecutor, sensing the right moment, gently said to the child, "Would you like to wave goodbye to Rex before we continue?" Her tiny hand lifted tentatively. "Bye, Rex," she whispered, voice full of affection and reverence. Rex's ears twitched, and his head moved slightly in response, as though recognizing the gravity of her words. The courtroom exhaled collectively, witnessing the emotional connection in full display. The judge allowed a short recess for the courtroom to recover. Jurors filed out slowly, some whispering to one another, others sitting quietly in contemplation. Even seasoned officers, accustomed to witnessing trauma and heroism, found themselves affected in a profound way. The room had become more than a place of legal procedure. It had become a space of recognition, empathy, and reflection. The child and her mother stepped aside, holding hands, both taking comfort in the presence of Rex. For a moment, the gallery seemed to understand that justice was not always measured in documents, logic, or argument. Sometimes it was measured in courage, loyalty, and the truth conveyed through pure innocence. Even as the trial was set to resume, the judge's voice echoed softly, "Let this courtroom remember what has transpired here today. The witness and the K-9 have demonstrated bravery and integrity in the most extraordinary fashion. Their actions and words will remain part of the official record." The defense attorney muttered under his breath, defeated, while the prosecutor allowed himself a brief, private smile. They both understood that the emotional and factual resonance of what had occurred would shape the remainder of the trial. The child's courage, paired with Rex's unwavering presence, had shifted the narrative irreversibly. The courtroom settled into an uneasy calm. Each person, juror, officer, and spectator, carried a piece of the child's experience with them. The memory of her small hands reaching for Rex, the timbre of her trembling voice, and the steadfastness of the dog would not fade. And in that silence, the courtroom collectively acknowledged an unspoken truth, that bravery and trust can exist in the smallest among us, and sometimes the bond between a human and an animal can speak louder than any argument ever could. The judge adjusted his robe and gavel, the weight of the moment still lingering in his mind. "We will continue the proceedings shortly," he said. Yet even as he spoke, it was clear that nothing would ever be the same in that courtroom. The little girl, holding her rabbit tightly, looked at Rex one final time before being guided away. Her eyes met his, and in that glance, the bond between rescuer and rescued was undeniable. Even as the court continued with the technicalities of law, the hearts of everyone present had already been touched. Two beings, a child and a dog, had spoken a truth no words could fully capture, yet everyone understood it perfectly. The courtroom had returned to its formal rhythm, yet the memory of the child's testimony and Rex's presence lingered like a soft hum, vibrating through the polished wood and high ceilings. Jurors sat in tense contemplation, pens poised above notebooks, yet their eyes frequently drifted to the child's empty seat and the steadfast K9. The emotional weight of what had transpired refused to dissipate, despite the procedural demands of the trial. A judge, hands folded, observed quietly as the next witness prepared to take the stand. Yet even as he presided over the legal formalities, his mind repeatedly returned to the simple yet profound truth delivered by a 3-year-old. He adjusted his glasses and cleared his throat, his voice carrying a rare softness. "This court has heard testimony of unparalleled significance today. Let it be noted that the courage and trust demonstrated by the witness and the heroic actions of the K-9 have provided a living testament that will weigh heavily upon all deliberations." The prosecutor, though accustomed to navigating high-profile cases, allowed himself a moment to exhale. He exchanged a glance with Rex's handler, silently acknowledging that the dog's role in the case had transcended the ordinary bounds of law enforcement. The K-9 had not only performed a rescue, but had also conveyed the emotional truth in a way that no document or expert could replicate. Outside the courtroom, news cameras broadcast the unfolding story to the nation. Social media erupted with clips and photographs of the child pointing to Rex, her small voice whispering the words that had captured the hearts of millions. "He saved me." The story quickly became a national sensation, capturing not just the heroic acts of law enforcement, but also the unbreakable bond between a child and the dog who had protected her. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere shifted as deliberations loomed. Jurors huddled, papers rustling as they began to discuss what they had witnessed. For the first time in their legal careers, many of them found themselves weighing the emotional and moral impact of a testimony alongside factual evidence. It was an unprecedented challenge, but one that reminded them of the humanity at the heart of the law. The child, guided by her mother, had returned to a quiet corner of the gallery, her rabbit clutched tightly to her chest. She had completed her testimony, yet she could not resist stealing glances at Rex. The dog, alert and patient, remained in place, a living emblem of loyalty and courage. Even in the stillness, their connection was unmistakable, radiating a quiet reassurance to everyone who observed. The judge resumed proceedings with solemnity, acknowledging the significance of the day. The court will now hear closing arguments. The weight of the evidence, including testimony that has profoundly moved this room, must be carefully considered by the jury. Justice is not solely a matter of facts and procedure. It is a matter of truth, integrity, and moral courage. As the prosecutor delivered his closing argument, he wove the child's testimony and Rex's heroic actions into a narrative that transcended mere evidence. He spoke not only of rescue and protection, but also of trust, loyalty, and the quiet heroism that often goes. His words carried weight precisely because they were grounded in the truth witnessed by every person in the courtroom. The defense attorney attempted his rebuttal, citing procedural technicalities and evidence that, under normal circumstances, might have carried significant influence. Yet the emotional resonance of the child's testimony combined with Rex's visible heroism, had created a force beyond logic or technicality. The courtroom itself seemed to acknowledge that some truths could not be undermined, no matter how meticulously argued. When the jury retired to deliberate, the room emptied slowly, yet a lingering hush remained. Officers and spectators remained, seated for a few moments longer, reflecting on the extraordinary sequence of events. Even the judge, back at his bench, allowed himself a quiet, reflective pause, considering how often courage and truth manifest in the smallest and most unexpected ways. Hours later, the jury returned. The atmosphere was tense, every breath in the room charged with anticipation. The foreperson, a middle-aged woman with a calm yet authoritative demeanor, stood to deliver the verdict. "We, the jury, have reached a unanimous decision," she began. The courtroom held its collective breath, the weight of the moment palpable. Based on the testimony presented, including the extraordinary account of the witness and the actions of the K-9, we find the defendant guilty. A ripple of relief and emotion swept through the courtroom. The little girl clutched her mother's hand tightly, her wide eyes blinking up at Rex, who responded with a slight tilt of his head, as if sharing in the victory. Jurors exhaled, spectators wept quietly, and even the judge allowed a subtle, almost imperceptible smile to cross his face. Justice had been served, but it had been delivered in a way that reminded everyone present of the extraordinary power of courage, loyalty, and truth. The child was invited, under careful supervision, to approach Rex once more. She hugged him tightly, her small arms barely wrapping around his broad chest. The dog responded with calm reassurance, leaning into her embrace, his presence steady and unwavering. In that moment, the room seemed to pause again, capturing a sense of completion and closure that went far beyond legal judgment. The prosecutor knelt beside the child and whispered, "You are very brave today. Rex is lucky to have had you." The little girl smiled, a mixture of pride and relief lighting her face. Rex nuzzled her gently, a silent acknowledgement that their bond had not only survived, but had played a crucial role in revealing the truth. The judge, rising to adjourn the court, allowed a final statement. This case serves as a reminder that truth can emerge in the most unexpected forms. Courage is not defined by age, and heroism is not limited to human hands. Today, we have witnessed the power of innocence, the loyalty of a faithful companion, and the enduring strength of the human spirit. As the gavel came down, signaling the conclusion of the trial, a collective sense of closure filled the courtroom. Reporters and spectators slowly exited, carrying with them the story that would be retold countless times. The story of a 3-year-old child, a canine named Rex, and the extraordinary courage that had changed the outcome of a trial. Outside the courthouse, the child and her mother paused for a moment, allowing the weight of the day to settle. Rex remained close, his handler at his side, vigilant yet calm. Journalists and onlookers captured the scene, but the child was focused solely on the dog who had saved her. Her tiny voice whispered, almost as if for herself, "Thank you, Rex." The dog responded with a gentle nuzzle, the silent affirmation of a bond that would endure far beyond that courtroom. That day, the courtroom had witnessed something rare: justice, truth, and heroism converging in a moment of unparalleled emotional clarity. The little girl had spoken 2 simple words, yet their power had reverberated throughout the legal system, touching the hearts of everyone present. The K-9 had acted not just as a rescuer, but as a living testament to the profound connection between humans and the animals who protect them. As the crowd dispersed, the story of the child and Rex spread across the nation. It became a symbol of courage, hope, and the extraordinary ways in which truth can manifest. The courtroom would return to its daily proceedings, the judge to other cases, the jurors to their lives. But the impact of those 2 words, "he saved," and the living presence of Rex would remain with them forever. In the quiet moments after the trial, the child hugged her mother tightly and reached for Rex one last time. Her small hand rested on his fur, a gesture filled with gratitude, awe, and love. The dog's steady presence reassured her. Together, they had not only survived a harrowing ordeal, but had also conveyed a truth so profound that it could never be forgotten. And so, the trial concluded, but the story of courage, loyalty, and unwavering trust endured, leaving an indelible mark on every heart present. A story of 2 lives intertwined by fear, bravery, and the simple yet powerful words that had frozen a courtroom. He saved.